The first question, Prime Minister, is really just looking at the year, events since the election. When you look back at your time so far as Prime Minister and at the government's work so far, when you look back, what are you proudest of so far and what you've done?
I think resetting Australia's position internationally, and part of the precondition for that, as I've said, is action on climate change, is what is the entry fee into the room of goodwill in international relations. But we'd been through a difficult time. Our Pacific relationships were at a nadir. We rebuilt them by going to the Pacific Island Forum by Penny Wong, and just this week there's a bipartisan delegation around the Pacific, and that intense engagement that we've had, rebuilding relationships with ASEAN to our north, so important for our future economy. We have appointed someone like Nicholas Moore, former head of Macquarie Bank, as our envoy to Southeast Asia. Indonesia's going to be the fourth largest economy in the world in coming decades, so we need those relationships. And of course it began with the Quad leaders meeting, just the day literally we were sworn in. Just by Monday evening, May 23rd, I was there in Tokyo, ready to meet with President Biden, Prime Minister Kishida and Prime Minister Modi. I attended the NATO Leaders Summit in Madrid. We visited Ukraine and met with President Zelensky. The engagement with the G20 that we held as well, rebuilding relationships with France. All of this in today's globalised world is absolutely critical, and I think it's been a major turnaround in a relatively short period of time, as well as all of the domestic things that we have done, of course.
Did Biden surprise you in the way that he handled that meeting? He was like an old friend to you, even though I think that you might have met once before, maybe twice before, but certainly it was an effusive greeting from the US President at that Quad meeting, I thought.
It was incredibly warm. And all of the meetings with the three leaders I've met with now on a number of occasions, but President Biden was particularly warm, engaging. We've had the opportunity to have meetings since in Madrid, in London, at the time of the Queen's funeral, and of course there in Asia as well during the G20 meeting was very important. So it was just a great beginning, really. And what I think it enabled the government to do was very quickly move from being an opposition and an alternative government into being the government very quickly. It sped up that transition that normally occurs over months, if not weeks, into just a matter of days.
Now, some of the optics there would suggest to Australians that with a new government, a Labor government now, there's not going to be any difference in terms of our relationship with the United States, that you've sent a message that you are 100% with the alliance with the United States after 9 years of coalition government. Is there any difference in your handling of that US alliance compared to the coalition?
I think there is, of course, bipartisan support for the US alliance, but Labor's very proud that the US alliance, of course, can be traced back to the statement of John Curtin, bringing Australian troops home during World War II and saying that Australia looked to America. And that is where you can see the alliance being forged at our darkest hour. And so ever since then, Labor governments have worked with the United States, but so too have coalition governments. I think our agenda is much closer to the Biden government's agenda. We understand, as do they, that climate change is a national security issue. as well as an environmental issue and an economic issue of transformation. Their Inflation Reduction Act is an extraordinarily large infrastructure stimulus based upon that transition to a clean energy economy. I think also the issue of trust. President Biden knows that we are strong supporters of AUKUS, and indeed the United States asked that we be briefed in advance on the arrangements, and of course Prime Minister Morrison chose not to do that until the last minute. That of course is a matter for him, but I think the relationship with the United States has never been stronger and is so important in the region as well.
There is a school of thought that says we don't need the submarines under the AUKUS agreement, that we've gone too far in reaching this agreement with the United States. For those critics of the agreement, they'd be worried that your government would give the US what it wants rather than what's in Australia's interest. So what's your answer to those people who are sceptical about the sheer amount of money going towards the submarines and whether that is doing too much in terms of tightening our alliance with the United States?
My answer is that the Defence Strategic Review that's being undertaken by Angus Houston and Stephen Smith is, in the interim report, very much talking about the need for self-reliance, the need to recognise that what was thought to be a 10-year window of warning for any potential military conflict has been narrowed, that we need to make sure that our defence assets are fit for purpose. Now, our defence assets need to not be about fighting a land war defending Western Queensland, because that is highly unlikely, but a lot of our assets are not really the ones that we necessarily need for this century and for the times, and also their location as well. But our US alliance is critical for Australia, and the advice very clearly that we received at the time the decision was made, and why we gave support in principle to it, but since then as well, the obviously much more detailed briefings that we have had indicate that nuclear submarines, for a range of reasons, for how long they can stay underwater, for their detectability, for their operability, the way they operate, are the assets that we need. And that's why we're making that decision in Australia's national interest. Yes, it's about our relationships with the United States and the UK, two important relationships that go back a long way, but we are also very confident that in all of these decisions that we're making, it's about Australia's national interest and our capacity to make sure that we can defend ourselves.
You mentioned the unlikely prospect of a land war in Western Queensland. Do I take it from that buying a lot of tanks is not necessarily going to be a priority for your government?
Well, that's right, and you'll see that reflected, I'm sure, in the strategic review that's being undertaken. It's a matter of having the right assets for what's required in recent times, because Australia's been engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan. That has resulted in a defence force structure that reflects where our engagement has been. Now, in 2022, looking forward for what Australia's needs are, that needs to be the priority that we have. We need to make sure that we have appropriate defence spending, and I've committed to at least 2% being spent on defence. I expect that will rise in the future rather than decrease because of the issues that we're facing.
Above 2%?
Well, 2% is a minimum. So we need to be prepared to invest what we need to promote peace and security in the region. One of the objectives of defence as well for a country like Australia with the values that we have isn't to attack any other nation, is to respect national sovereignty, but to make sure that we can defend ourselves, and make sure as well that it acts as an appropriate deterrence, the fact that we can defend ourselves.
But when you came into power and you were given a lot of briefings from senior officials about the state of Australia, were you concerned at all that Australia looked a bit underpowered in terms of defence, or a bit defenceless?
Well, quite clearly there's a range of assets. I'll wait for the review, and of course some of these issues are issues we don't talk about. But it is obvious to your readers, for example, that in terms of cybersecurity, that it's a much bigger issue than it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago. We're seeing regular attacks. So that the nature of our security needs has changed. Our investment needs to change accordingly as well. And so we have a lot of heavy machinery, heavy vehicles. What we need is appropriate assets. And the review that I committed to, indeed I committed to at the time of the ANZUS 70th anniversary speech that I gave in the Parliament, I committed there to the Defence Force Posture Review going forward. That is where our assets would be placed. What we also need, and what the strategic review is doing, is not just where, but what are our assets.
The other thing that happened on national security and foreign affairs was your meeting with President Xi. What approach did you take to setting up that meeting, and can you give us a sense of how that meeting went, given that we've been hearing complaints from the Chinese side about Australia for several years now? Was that tone of complaint part of the meeting?
It was a very constructive meeting. It's the first meeting that an Australian leader has had since 2016. We went into it, both sides, without preconditions. So it was a good exchange, but it was a constructive exchange. It followed meetings between our foreign ministers and our defence ministers. I found President Xi very engaging. I had a discussion 2 nights before with the Chinese Premier, Li, and I indicated there very much I was looking forward to the meeting. We hadn't yet announced that the meeting would take place, but obviously these meetings don't happen spontaneously. We agreed on a time in which it would be announced that we would have that meeting. And it was, I think, on both sides, there was a lot of goodwill.
Do you think the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between Australia and China will actually cement that goodwill? Do you think there can be another step taken around that anniversary?
I think it has already. One of the discussions that we had there with President Xi was, I certainly spoke about the recognition that comes on the 21st of December. And President Xi also had an interesting anecdote about Confucius. And that Confucius speaks about 50 years being the date in which maturity happens. So we spoke about the maturity of our relationship. And that was a good thing about the meeting, was that I put clearly Australia's differences that we have with China over South China Sea, our position for the status quo in Taiwan, the position with human rights issues, including the ongoing detaining of Australian citizens. We put forward those things, but we put them forward in, I think, a respectful but clear way. We need to be honest with each other. And what I have said is that we need to cooperate with China where we can, but disagree where we must. And that was, I think, the tone of the discussions that occurred.
At the beginning, I asked about when you look back at the year and what you're proud of. Inevitably, there are lessons out of the first months of the government, and I'm interested in your thoughts on areas where you think there might be lessons learned for the government in the way that it's conducted itself in those first months, whether there are any thoughts on your side about opportunities missed where you might have been able to do more faster in any particular area. I know it's only since May, but it is a question on my mind about how the government's fared.
Yeah. Well, from my perspective, what you can do at the beginning of a government, and particularly in the first 6 months, is to set a narrative. And that was what I was determined to do, to set a tone, if you like, of the way that the government would operate. And what's been most pleasing to me is that the team has functioned so well. I see myself as the captain of the team. I don't have to bowl every ball and hit every run and field take every catch. My job is to do my job as the captain and to have trust and faith in the team to perform. And that has occurred, I believe, across the economic, social and environmental and indeed international portfolios has all occurred. So that's been a positive thing. I think we also have engaged appropriately. People had conflict fatigue. The Morrison government was always looking for an argument. I think people want to look for solutions, and they don't want people to just oppose things and yell at each other. They want people to try and work things through. So if you look at the tone of National Cabinet, it's changed. It used to be there'd be a meeting and then there'd be multiple press conferences announcing multiple actions. What we've managed to achieve with some of the changes that we've made in health, some of the reform arrangements we've made in areas like TAFE and skills development, the arrangements that we're putting in place for energy policy, I don't believe would have happened without a change of government, and that cooperative relationship across the spectrum is what people want to see. The Jobs and Skills Summit, where we brought together business, unions and civil society in constructive dialogue over 2 days and a dinner at night, was really positive as well. So the government has been setting about, of course, if you like, ticking off our agenda. I've been very conscious that the commitments that we made at the election in May needed to be delivered, needed to be in the budget, and we have done an enormous number of those have already passed the Parliament.
The energy crisis in June has had consequences through to now, of course, and when I look at the events of June, you came up with a gas agreement with the gas exporters. You've gone further than that now. And I wonder whether, looking back, you could have gone further, more firmly in June with those gas companies back then. Perhaps you were more cautious at the time. Do you look back then and think, look, I could have gone harder sooner on this energy issue?
There's an argument that could have occurred, but I think that really what occurred there is that the actions that we're taking, we accept aren't normal business. They are extraordinary actions because of extraordinary circumstances. And we want markets to be able to operate. So it is reluctantly that we have stepped in the way that we have, but we've needed to do so. And the market, if you like, was given every opportunity to not require an intervention. There is no reason why there couldn't have been a supply voluntarily at reasonable costs to manufacturing, but what we saw was those prices increase enormously and manufacturers really be under significant pressure. Now, we can't just sit back and say, not only is it the companies getting international prices for exports, which they're certainly entitled to do, but the fact that domestic businesses potentially were being hit with international prices when there'd been no change to the production costs for the companies is, in my view, something that legitimises and indeed requires government intervention, which is what we have done.
Do you think that we're now looking at a different world to a couple of decades ago, and where we do have a different era that requires government intervention? And I'm not just thinking of energy, I'm thinking of other sectors. There used to be a school of thought about small government and about the free market. Do you think that that has shown its limitations and that this is an era where government intervention is needed?
Well, when markets are failing, there is a need for government intervention. I think that markets can be democratic mechanisms in which the people get to have their say depending upon where they choose to act. But at times, markets can not operate in an appropriate way. What we're seeing now globally is the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So in the United Kingdom, you have these windfall profits being taxed at quite a high rate, that being used to guarantee rebates and maximum energy bills for customers, a much more significant intervention than we're proposing here in Australia.
You mean by a Conservative government?
By a British Conservative government. And we're seeing intervention throughout Europe because there is a need to do so.
So you're not being a more Labor interventionist left-wing government?
No, we're doing what's required. Yeah. And what we're not, though, is prepared to just sit back and believe. To me, the ideological response isn't to the intervention that we're doing. The ideological response would be to sit back, allow businesses to fail, which would then take a long time and potentially never come back in terms of manufacturing, and to say that's all okay because that's the market operating. Well, it's not the market operating. It's a distortion in the market caused by a land war in Europe.
The reason I ask is because I'm aware of your background and your formative experience in studying economics and political economy, and I know, and I have a question about your ideological beliefs and how they've changed over time. Because of course you are a member of the Labor left. I wonder, are you less left wing than you used to be?
Oh, I am who I am, and of course, people change their views on things all the time. They grow. And I think I'm someone who has learnt a lot. I learn something new every day. My mentor, as you know, was Tom Uren, and he used to say two things. You've got to learn something new every day, and you've got to get better as a person every day. So one of the great benefits of being in politics for a considerable period of time, and something I bring to now the great honour of being Prime Minister, is that experience, that engagement. I'm connected up with, I think, more business leaders than anyone currently in the Parliament. I'm also close to...
Do you mean you've got them on speed dial? You can call any of them when you need?
I can call just about all of them when I need to. I have relationships that have been built up over a long period of time. And a relationship of trust is one that's forged in difficulty. And you get trust when your word can result in action. So if you look at what I've done throughout my career, it has looked at tripartite. How do you bring people together? The creation of Infrastructure Australia, the creation of the Major Cities Unit, the creation of the Australian Council of Local Government were all models based upon bringing business, unions, academics, government, including the public service, together to get the best advice and then act on it. And it's that's something that has characterised my political engagement. It's characterising now the formation of Jobs and Skills Australia to work out training and skills opportunities. It's characterised the Jobs and Skills Summit that I called for and committed to before the election. It's characterised a range of bodies that we're establishing, including the way that on climate, for example, we delivered support of all of the business communities, the National Farmers Federation, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, as well as the Clean Energy Council and the ACF.
Now, the business community is not happy with elements of the IR law. The gas exporters are very unhappy about the energy package. Are you saying that you'll be able to smooth over those differences with the business community over time, simply from personal relationships?
I'm saying that over a period of time, some of the criticisms which have been put will prove to be unfounded. The industrial relations changes are modest changes. They are about getting wages moving. They are about rebalancing the way that the system was operating so that there was an incentive in the system for enterprise bargaining to not occur because of the way that you could fall back to, or businesses could threaten to fall back to the base award, and that was having a counterproductive impact on the way that industrial relations was occurring in this country. Consulting and engaging doesn't mean never disagreeing. If you're going to do things, and I want to lead a government that does things, then occasionally you will have people come out and they'll put their views. But they'll be listened to respectfully and take at the height of the industrial relations debate. In that last sitting fortnight, I addressed the Australian Industry Group dinner. I took questions for about an hour after my speech. I think on the day that the night before the legislation was carried through the Parliament, I addressed the AUKUS dinner in the Great Hall of Parliament House. And again, I engaged with business leaders there. My door's always open. That doesn't mean that you will agree, but it does mean that if you get a commitment, it'll be carried through. And it does mean that the dialogue has meaning. And in the industrial relations legislation, we made a range of amendments at the request of business, unions, crossbenchers. We got a better outcome because it was consultative on the current legislation that's proposed on energy. We're continuing to consult, we're continuing to engage. Over the weekend, I spoke to a range of business leaders. We delivered a uniform commitment on Friday of premiers, chief ministers, and the national government. That's not a uniform group there, and they have different interests, but they came to a common national interest as well.
You mentioned Tom Uren. You also mentioned changing the tone of politics since the election. The question about Tom Uren that's on my mind is, what was it that you admired most about him, and what would you say you're trying to emulate most in the way that you conduct yourself in politics? His gentleness.
He was someone he fought for the Australian Heavyweight Boxing Championship. He was a big man with a big heart. He was tough. He survived Timor, Changi, the Burma-Siam Railway, and Japan, close to Nagasaki, when the second atomic bomb dropped. This was someone who was resilient, but who never, ever hated anyone. It's quite extraordinary. He engaged very closely with Japan and the Japanese in the period in terms of reconciliation. He was someone who wanted to bring people together. He's someone who also understood that change doesn't occur just from the top. You've got to bring people with you on the journey of change. So when Labor's objectives and aims were being developed, Tom played the role in how change occurs and it occurs through community action and through that engagement as well. He's someone who always believed in dialogue, and he had good relations, for example, with Sir John Carrick, and him were of course POWs together, John Howard's mentor, and that was important as well to him.
So how would you score yourself in seeking to achieve the Tom Uren standard?
That's up to others to do that.
Because as a Prime Minister, there are going to be moments where there are haters out there and you've got to deal with them, and you can't always be gentle either. No,
and I'm someone who is quite capable of standing my ground. Being gentle doesn't mean that you can't be tough at the same time. And I was leader of the government in the House of Representatives during the Gillard government. They were tough days, every day, the suspension of standing orders. What was thrown at Prime Minister Gillard was quite extraordinary during that time. I'll stand my ground. You don't get to be leader of the Labor Party without being engaged in conflict from time to time. But I think it's a matter of trying to be constructive the whole way through. And even I think the role that I played in the Rudd and Gillard governments was to defend Labor's interests and the government's interests, to not be distracted by some of the internal issues that ended up causing such difficulties for governments of which I was very proud to serve, governments which in the end I think undermined itself rather than, and was cut short as a result.
We talked about what's happened since the election, but of course, looking ahead to next year, what would you say would be the top things on your agenda for 2023 that would be the top priorities for you?
I think one of the things is making sure that we cement the structures that were put in place, if you like. So on cheaper medicines comes in on January 1. Cheaper childcare comes in on July 1. Paid parental leave increases come in next year. The creation of the National Reconstruction Fund to support new industries and the clean energy transition works hand in hand with having the workforce to do that through Jobs and Skills Australia. So we've done a whole range of legislation, including, of course, the creation of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, making sure that we get that right. We want to not do, try and do 100 things. I'd rather do 20 things really well. But beneath that, of course, there's a range of other secondary things we're doing, changing the way that the migration system is working. Of course, we have in the first quarter of next year, we'll have the Defence Strategic documentation as well as the AUKUS arrangements being advanced. Continuing, of course, to work in the region to rebuild and strengthen those relations, including we'll host the Quad Leaders meeting here in Australia next year. And of course, in the second half of next year, the referendum is on Indigenous recognition is an enormous opportunity to bring the country together, to advance reconciliation and to treat Indigenous people with respect, but also so that Australians can feel more respect about ourselves as well. But there's a third element to it as well, which is the way that the world sees us will be impacted by the outcome of that referendum.
Some of the political commentary around the Indigenous voice presents it as an issue where if it fails, that's on you, that's your political authority challenged or diminished. Do you see it that way? Do you see it as a personal test for you to make sure that that voice succeeds?
It's not about me. One of the things that I've been determined to do is to make sure that the Australian people have ownership of this. Now, part of the criticism has been, what precisely from A to Z of the voice. Why isn't Anthony Albanese putting out every bit of the detail? It's not my detail. It's not mine to put out. And it is unfortunate that some people said, including some people in the coalition said, well, we don't know what the question is. So I went very early on to Gama. I put out what I thought the question should be and what the precise constitutional amendment should be. They weren't my words, they were words that were worked on by some of the best legal minds in this country. But we put it out there many months ago now. It's been out there in all of its detail. There's a 200-page document, was worked on by Marcia Langton and Tom Uren, went to the former government's cabinet not once but twice and was debated. So there's a lot of detail out there already. This is important for Australia, and I am determined to leave the door open. I want as broad a support as possible for this change.
But do you think those supporters are vocal enough? Do you think that the yes case has got enough power at the moment? Or do you think that there are a few too many people who might be expecting you to do all the work and for the government to do all the work of advocating?
No, there's a lot of work happening behind the scenes as well. If you look at...
So you think it'll succeed?
I think will succeed. I certainly hope that it does. Do I take it for granted? No. What we know is that constitutional change in this country is very difficult. Yeah. But if you look at the trade union movement, completely on board with this change. The business community, whether it's the BCA, AUKUS, Australian Industry Group, the Minerals Council, individual companies are all on board and are all saying they're going to campaign for the voice.
Would a defeat for the voice mean a referendum on the Republic is impossible?
I'm just focused on one referendum and one referendum only, which is the voice. I think it is really important that this get done. One of the things I said in terms of the timing, I can't imagine having a referendum on the Republic, on who our head of state would be, when our Constitution doesn't acknowledge that the great privilege that we have of living with the oldest continuous culture on earth. It purports that our history began in 1788, and we know it's at least 60,000 years older than that.
Do you think, or do you want to be the Prime Minister of an Australia that is a republic?
I'm a Republican, but in terms of timetables and all of that, that's not on my agenda. My sole constitutional change that I'm giving any thought to is, I believe, the most important one, by a long way.
You're riding high in the polls personally, and the government is in a very strong position in opinion polling in our mastheads, but also elsewhere. When you look at the political landscape now, you've been in opposition for many years in the past, you know what it's like. Do you look at the coalition and think that they really are going to struggle to come back, given the Teals hold those Liberal seats in the cities? They just can't come back at the moment at the next election?
Well, I don't take anything for granted. One of the things that experience brings you is that change can happen very quickly. So what I'm determined to do, though, is to just govern. Just govern. If you govern well, do what we said we would do, not play politics every day, not give thought to, okay, how can we wedge the other side, but just get on with governing. I think that the former government acted like an opposition too much. They sat there and tried to think through how they could trick issues in the parliament. We're just getting on with it, of implementing our agenda. I think it was a mistake, for example, for the Liberal leader to not attend the Jobs and Skills Summit when he was invited. It was a mistake to not vote for a better climate policy than they'd had. Clearly, the Australian people had a very clear mandate at the election on that. I think it's a mistake to position themselves the way that they are at the moment on energy policy to be in favour of higher energy prices is quite extraordinary. So it's up to them though. I think that they should, it's in Australia's national interest for them to support a referendum. You have Ken Wyatt, the former Indigenous minister, who for the last term was committed to something happening. Nothing happened.
So if they're in a bit of a mess from your point of view in terms of policy, so you're in a pretty strong position at the next election.
Well, we'll wait and see. But I'll say this as well, that if you look at the current ministry, who would you swap? Which shadow minister would you put in a combined team ahead of a minister? And I struggle to find one.
The polls could also be influenced by this, debate we're all having now about what happened in the 9 years of coalition government, including some of what former Prime Minister Scott Morrison did, the revelations about the 5 ministries. That's obviously been a major subject of debate, but when you look at that time, you see things that you would not do, but also do you see things that are dangers for any government in the way it might behave, in the centralisation of power?
Absolutely.
In the creeping arrogance that any government can show? Do you think that there's a danger for any of your side as you hold on to power?
There are absolute lessons to learn when you have a look at what is there. And I last week had the opportunity to read Nikki Sava's book that detailed some issues that I didn't know about beforehand, with former government members speaking about them. I think there's a range of lessons. Of course, I still cannot imagine the mindset that caused Scott Morrison to appoint himself to multiple ministries. But even that aside, I think the other problem, really the deeper problem, is that people sat back and allowed that to happen. Is that people thought it was okay to have a cabinet committee of one, where Scott Morrison was the only member, that people enabled these decisions to be made when Barnaby Joyce, as Deputy Prime Minister, found out about the multiple ministries. He chose not to do anything because he was worried about losing staff and losing a ministerial position for the National Party. People knew this was occurring, that massive centralisation of power. I've had ministers tell me that they found out about decisions in their portfolio when the media release with their name on the top went out.
Are you sure that you're getting enough robust advice from the public sector now? And are you sure that your ministers are going to have what it takes to come into your office and say, no, it can't, that can't happen, and give you a different opinion?
Absolutely. And part of the lesson is how you run an opposition feeds into how you run a government. So in opposition, the shadow cabinet had real discussions. We didn't have pre-caucusing beforehand of a leadership group and a lock-in, and that has fed into better practice in government as well. The cabinet's functioning properly. The committee processes, the ERC, the National Security Committee and other bodies are functioning properly. Ministers are engaging with their departments properly. All of the ministers in the government, one of the first things that they did, and we didn't have to round people up to do this, they all went down to their departments, not the other way around, and talked not just to the departmental secretaries, talked to people throughout the department, went through the building, said hello to people, developed those relationships. And I remember that being so important the last time I was a minister. You get far more out of people if there's that genuine engagement with them. I took the whole ministry down to Prime Minister and Cabinet. We had a meeting down there as well.
But are you confident, this is the other aspect of experience over the years in Canberra, that internal machinations, the sheer ambition for personal power is under control, at least to a point where we won't get the revolving door and the spill fever that we've had in Australian politics in the past? Do you think that you can ensure and tell Australian voters that that's not going to happen in this administration?
Absolutely.
How can you be so confident?
Because of the way that the government is functioning each and every day. It functions so that there are real debates occurring in the rooms where they should occur. The fact that the AUKUS is functioning well. The experience as well, I think that the Hawke government learnt from the Whitlam government, and my government has learnt from the Rudd and Gillard governments. What they did right, but also some of the weaknesses that were exposed there. And one of the strengths of the government is the way that it's working in such a cohesive way. I can't recall in my entire time in Parliament a more united team than we have at the moment.
You are one of the few in the government now who was a cabinet minister for the entirety of the Rudd and Gillard time, 6 years. There are only a handful of you. So when you...
3, I think.
Is that right? Yep. It's you and it's Penny Wong and...
Tony Burke.
Tony Burke, of course. So when you talk about lessons from that time, you saw it all up close. For you, what's the lesson?
The lesson is that unity is critical. The lesson is be focused, be clear about what your objectives are. Make sure that the team know that and that is agreed. And so, to give an example, in 2019, I went to the National Press Club after we had the review of the election losses in 13, 16 and 19, conducted by Jay Weatherall and Craig Emerson. I went to the National Press Club. I said, this is our plan for the term. 4 quarters, I went through the phases. We did that with the vision statements as where it began, and then we went through the review, vision statements, platform, and then policy announcements during the election campaign. I said we'd kick with the wind in the 4th quarter. We set out to do that. We had the announcements building up over a period of time with childcare and the Rewiring the Nation policy in the first announcement, first budget reply, then housing, then aged care, but we then also had the climate policy announced in December of last year. So we strategically set out an objective. We didn't try to win every day in the 24-hour media cycle, and that can be frustrating perhaps for the press gallery, but it's a conscious decision to function properly. That's what we're doing now as well. We set out the objectives. I've set out and said before the election in May, I said we had a plan for 2025. You're seeing that play out.
So you said you'd kick with the wind, and you did. You weren't Labor's first choice for leader when it first went into opposition. At key points in the last 3 years, you haven't been preferred Prime Minister against Scott Morrison in the polls. Do you feel you've been underestimated?
I feel like I've been underestimated my whole life.
Why?
But here I am. I think if you come from my background, I didn't have a sense of destiny of being Prime Minister of Australia. I regard it as an incredible privilege. I'll never take it for granted. I am incredibly honoured to have this position, and I feel an incredible responsibility. I'm really optimistic about Australia's future. I think if we seize the opportunities that are there to be a renewable energy superpower, to have new industries driven by cheap, clean energy, manufacturing more things here, giving Australians those skills and opportunities to make the best of their lives that they can, with the social policy that we have, one that is an inclusive society, including reconciliation with First Nations people, engaging in the region. We're located in the fastest growing region of the world in human history. That presents an incredible opportunity for us if we get it right, if we get it right.
But it could be a tough year next year for many Australians. Real wages are still not going to be growing because of inflation. What's your message to those Australians who'll see things get tougher, maybe at Christmas time, but maybe next year? Are you sure it's actually going to get better for them?
Well, we have an economic plan to lift living standards, to grow the economy, to create opportunity. We have a social plan.
But will their wages grow one day?
That's about, well, that is precisely the plan. But you grow wages not by just saying it. You grow wages by putting in place structures that boost productivity, that boost business opportunities, that grow the private sector, that grow jobs. We have a plan to do that, and a plan to make sure it's inclusive growth as well. And one of the things I've been heartened by in some of the international engagement as well is how common the views are across the world and across some of the international agencies as well about what the future looks like for humanity. Now, we need to make sure as we do that, that we deal with some of the tensions that are there with strategic competition, including in our own region. We will have things come at us inevitably that aren't foreseen. The idea of a land war where people are building trenches was thought to be something that was consigned to history, but it's happening right now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that's having an impact on the global economy. So we'll continue to have to deal with challenges, and we don't know what new challenges will bring. And certainly when the pandemic hit, that was a major challenge to us as an opposition, of course, as well. A major challenge, but we acted responsibly. One of the things I said to the caucus at that time was that sometimes when you're in the surf, a big wave comes that you're not expecting, and you can either stand there and look at it and be surprised by it, or you can duck under, hold your breath, wait to come up and wait for the good waves to take you in. Well, the good waves took us into the beach on the 21st of May. We need to make sure that we deliver on our commitments. I'm confident that we can.
Thanks, PM.
Thanks very much, David.